This is a Kemp Oral History Project interview with former Vice President Dick Cheney. Today is November 30th, 2011, and we are doing the interview at the Vice President's home in McLean, Virginia. Thank you so much for doing this.
Happy to do it, Martin.
When did you first hear about Jack Kemp, and when did you first meet him?
Well, I'd heard of Jack before I really got to know him. I was first came to town during the Nixon-Ford years and worked in the first Nixon term and then for Jerry Ford. And it was along, as I recall, in the mid-'70s when Jack first came to Congress. Mm-hmm. And you heard about Jack in part. He was sort of a standout in the political community in a sense. Of course, he played professional football, and that made him unique. A lot of guys were more interested in football than they were in politics. But he also had developed and was developing the reputation as a guy who was very interested in policy, and especially in tax policy. When I got to know him was in 1978 when I ran for Congress for the first time. Got elected and came back to Washington. And of course, Jack was already a member of the House by then. And then in 1980, Jack and I ran for the leadership. And we elected a new leadership team in 1980. Bob Michael is the leader, Trent Lott is the whip. Jack was number 3 as the conference chairman, and I was the policy chairman. And that was basically the leadership structure for about 6 years. And I sat side by side with Jack through all those leadership meetings and throughout most of the Reagan years.
Do you recall your first actual meeting with him, what the circumstances were?
I don't. I knew the Bill Steiger from Wisconsin. Bill was a good friend. I'd worked for Bill briefly before I went to work in the Nixon administration, and of course Bill and Cliff Hansen from Wyoming had gotten the Steiger-Hansen amendment adopted on tax policy in, I believe it was about 1977. It was the beginning of the Carter administration, and then by the time I ran in 78, and we got into 79 and 80, we increasingly got involved in supply side economics, tax cuts, Laffer curve, and so forth. And Jack was deeply involved in all of those kinds of issues, and really a sort of an unofficial leader, if you will, and then became chairman of the conference and had great influence, if you will. He was also clearly identified as a Reagan man and a Reagan supporter. And I'd, of course, been a Ford man in 76 when we'd run against each other. I hadn't encountered Jack at that stage. But along in the 1980-81 time frame, Jack was a prominent member of the House, I would say. Even though it was early in his career, he didn't have a lot of seniority. Wasn't even on the Ways and Means Committee, I don't believe. But he was a strong enough and dynamic enough personality and deeply involved in these issues that he stood out as a member. And there are lots of ways to advance yourself in the House. You can put in the years on the committee and work your way up in the seniority system, become an expert in some particular subject based upon the areas you're working in. Jack was different in the sense that he was a standout, even though he didn't really have a claim, for example, to a seat on the tax writing committee. Jack was nonetheless a prominent spokesman and thinker about things relating to the economy and tax policy and so forth.
What are your standout memories of interaction with him over these many years that you've known him?
Well, Jack was a dynamo. He was had a very high energy level, if I can describe it in those terms. He was heavily involved not only in the policy debates, but he spent a lot of time out on the campaign trail, if you will. He would go out and did a lot of fundraising for other members of the House and other candidates. Jack was a major resource if you could get him to come to your district. partly because everybody knew him so well, and he was a standout individual. Can you get somebody to kill that, Christina, or have somebody answer it when it rings? So if you had a choice, probably you'd like to have President Reagan come to your district if you could, but second only to the president would be Jack, because he had that kind of appeal, and a lot of people know him from his football background and career. There was another area that Jack was deeply interested and involved in, and that was the role of minorities in the Republican Party. And he had, of course, in professional sports, professional football, he had a lot of friends, for example, in the African American community and guys he played ball with. And Jack, probably as much as anybody in our caucus on the House side in the Republican Party, had good ties into the African American community. Lots of friends, and outspoken in his belief in the Big Tent and support for having a broadly based party. Really a leader, if you will, to the extent there was such a thing on the Republican side in the House in those days.
How would you describe your relationship with him? Were you friends? Were you close friends?
I would describe it as good friends. We knew Jack and Joanne well. We had the opportunity, partly because we were both part of the leadership, and as I say, sat next to each other for years in all those leadership meetings, that we were good friends, I guess is the way I would describe it. I was probably more conservative than Jack, if you looked at my voting record. I had a different style of operation. I mean, Jack was a strong, flashy personality. I was more quieter, soft-spoken, did a lot of work behind the scenes, and I had a lot of interest in national security, foreign policy, intelligence, and so forth. So our views were pretty similar, but we had the opportunity over the years to work on a number of issues. We didn't always agree. There were occasions when there'd be disagreements, as there were with everybody. But I then benefited in 1987, thereabouts. Jack was running for president and decided to step down from the leadership position so he could devote full time really to his campaign. And when he stepped down as caucus chairman, I replaced him, which moved me up the leadership ladder one more notch. And then after the '88 election, then I ran for and won the post as the whip, the number 2 Republican in the House, when Trent Lott went to the Senate. So we were sort of on that track together, the three of us. And both Jack and Trent, for separate reasons, moved aside, and that gave me an opportunity to move up.
You mentioned that you both were conservatives, but you think you were more than he. What issues would you say you differed on?
Well, I think I probably started out more as a conventional conservative when we got into things like spending, and with respect to a sort of a more of a fiscal conservative on policy. Jack sometimes was tilted over more in the direction of enterprise zones, and I think was probably less committed than I was on fiscal policy. I'm guessing that's where, if you looked at our voting records there, I would have been more conservative on those kinds of issues than Jack was. Not that Jack was a liberal, he wasn't. But his priority would have been more in terms of economic growth and development and opportunity. And I had a more conventional view of the world. Somebody who was a small government conservative, I think would be a fair way to describe it. And a strong interest, as I say, in defense and national security issues. Jack was interested in those too, but he spent more time on the tax stuff and on the economy.
He described himself as a bleeding heart conservative and a big tent conservative and somebody, as you mentioned, reaching out to blacks and so on. What did his colleagues think about all that stuff, about of those tendencies on his part? What did you think about all of that?
Well, I liked it. I was a big fan of Jack's, and I thought he added a lot to our party. Not everybody shared that view. Jack was one of those guys who he had good ties to the younger members. He'd preceded some of them in terms of arriving here, but in a sense, Jack was a star from the day he walked into the House. And for most of the members who were already here, a lot of them had to work hard to get to the point where they had influence or where they could wield an influence in terms of affecting legislation or being a spokesman on various kinds of issues. And Jack just sort of walked in and laid claim to that kind of role. He didn't ask anybody, didn't have to ask anybody. Especially a lot of the younger members were intrigued with him. I mean, if you looked at the group that formed around Gingrich when Newt came, Newt was a classmate of mine. And there was a group of Gingrich and Vin Weber and Bob Walker and so forth, part of what used to be called the Conservative Opportunity Society. And Jack would have found a lot of support in that circuit. Not that he was an active part of the group. He'd sort of moved beyond that. But those younger members, as they came on, Jack was an identifiable personality, somebody that had an impact and was busy in terms of the work that needed to go on in the Congress.
Those guys, the Conservative Opportunity Society, they were Young Turks, so-called. Mm-hmm. They made 1-minute speeches all the time. Right. They railed against the Democrats. They used to rail against their own leadership half the time. Now, you describe yourself in the book as a bridge between the leadership and them. Where did Jack fit into this picture?
Well, I think I'm just probably a good question. That'd be a good question to ask somebody like Bob Michael and how Bob saw those relationships. I had the impression that Jack was more involved with sort of Jack's agenda. That probably you wouldn't see Jack running to replace Bob Michael as leader in the House. The day-to-day work of running the House Republican operation wasn't something that would have appealed to Jack. He wanted to be out there making good, tough policy speeches, campaigning, working hard on those issues that he cared about, but less, I think of him as less a man of the House than some of the other guys who came in and worked their way up and were part of the institution itself. So it's not a negative, it's a choice that members make in terms of how they're going to pursue their career interest. And Jack could sometimes aggravate his colleagues, or a few of them. He might get involved, for example, in an issue where he disagreed on some matter of policy, tax policy, for example, and would end up crossways with some of the old guard on issues that involved a particular set of concerns.
Remember any
or piece of
specific
legislation.
cases?
I don't. I'm trying to think of some now.
We've been told in various interviews that there were a lot of older members, especially Ways and Means Committee
Right.
Senior people, who resented his interloping into tax policy. Did you encounter any of that?
Yeah, I think that was a fair statement. Again, and I went back to this notion that Jack had these ideas that he actively and aggressively pursued and became a spokesman for, and could probably have generated, more TV cameras at a press conference to talk about tax policy than a lot of our colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee who were dealing with it every day. And I think on occasion, I think there were sentiments that were expressed, a feeling that Jack had gotten sort of out of his lane and was over in somebody else's turf. I think that happened occasionally when he was a cabinet member in the Bush administration.
We'll get to that.
Yeah. It was just part of it. I always looked on it, it was just Jack's enthusiasm and commitment to the cause. And, but it meant that he wasn't as solicitous sometimes of some of the older members' prerogatives, because they'd been here a long time doing it. But on the other hand, he wasn't the only one like that. The whole Gingrich operation was in part subject to that. I mean, Newt used to periodically self-destruct, and then he'd come see me and say, okay, what did I do now? How do I get out of it? How do we fix it? And then I'd sit down and talk with him and give him some thoughts on who he needed to go stroke to sort of rebuild some of those relationships.
Did you counsel Kemp along the similar lines?
And not to the extent that that Newt would come and seek my counsel on those kinds of things. Jack was less, Newt was trying to do something with the House. He believed that the Speaker of the House of Representatives was a more important post than the President of the United States. He, and his aim and objective was to take over the House, to have a Republican majority reestablished. It's very different from what Jack was trying to do. What Jack was trying to do was promote that set of policies that he cared about and believed in very deeply. And he could have done it as a senator. He could have done it maybe as a governor someplace. But he happened to be in the House at that time. That was the opportunity he had. And he used those tools for that purpose. But it wasn't with the idea in mind that he was going to take over the House somehow, which was a different agenda than Newt's.
So there, classically there are show horses and work horses.
Mm-hmm.
What was Jack?
Well, I think Jack was both. I mean, he clearly he knew how to generate a headline, worked with the press, colorful public personality, not inclined to sit in the back row and follow the lead of his elders. But he was a guy who did his homework. He knew his stuff substantively. And as I say, he spent a lot of time working on behalf of other members in terms of being a big draw from a fundraising standpoint and being willing to put chunks of time against helping his colleagues get reelected.
How smart was he?
I'd call Jack street smart. He wasn't an intellectual in sort of the classic case. I mean, this is not a guy who sought a PhD in whatever, economics, but he thought about policy more, I think, in terms of how it affected people and the lives of people. He had I think a deep interest in terms of how you could make the nation better by pursuing the tax policies he wanted to pursue. But it wasn't through any sort of esoteric insight with respect to tax policy. He'd work with a guy like Laffer or Jude Winniski and learn what they had to teach him. But I think he was very much, I would describe him as both a show horse and a workhorse.
Mm-hmm. Just to finish out your relationship, socially, you and Lynn Cheney and Joanne Kemp and Jack Kemp got together how often, and what did you do together?
Well, I can remember going to their house for dinner on a number of occasions, having them
trips,
over the
Super Bowls.
Never skied together, and I didn't go to the Super Bowl with him. I took Trent Lott skiing once. He'd never seen snow before in his life. But and then Jack and Joanne were over to the house when I was vice president, occasionally, and Lynn, for example, gave a seconding speech for Jack when he ran for vice president. So I guess that was the '96 convention. He asked Lynn to speak on his behalf, and she did.
Okay, let's do things chronologically a little bit.
Okay.
In the Nixon days, when you were at OEO and then at the Cost of Living Council, do you remember whether Jack Kemp was a backbencher, of course, he came to Congress in 1970. So did he register at all in the Nixon administration? I mean, he was opposed to wage and price controls, and he didn't like détente and stuff like that. But did anything sink in over at the Nixon White House?
Well, I'm sure it probably did, but I didn't know Jack in those days, and I didn't really begin to deal with the Hill that much until the Ford years. My boss was Don Rumsfeld, and we did wage price controls and so forth, but I didn't have any sort of major responsibilities on the Hill that would get me engaged with Jack. I knew some of the members, developed relationships with some of the members during that period of time, like Bob Michael, for example, but I didn't really know Jack well in those days.
Okay, let's go to the Ford years then. So you're Deputy White House Chief of Staff, then White House Chief of Staff. What did the Ford White House and Jerry Ford think about Kemp?
Well, Ford had a unique kind of relationship with the House generally, partly because most of them thought of him as good old Jerry. I used to be offended occasionally by the fact that they were so familiar, if you will, with the president. It was almost as though they knew him too well because he'd been their leader, and they thought of him as Jerry. And I always cringed a little bit inside when a member of Congress would call him Jerry instead of Mr. President. I always thought that was an important distinction to make, and that the title went with the job he now had, and that it would have been better if they had treated him and referred to him as the president instead of just Jerry. But he had a broad set of relationships with members on both sides of the aisle. I mean, he was a man of the House. He'd been there 25 years. He was close with people like Tip O'Neill and George Mahon, and I'm sure he knew Jack. I don't think it was especially close relationship. May have been closer than I was aware of, but Ford was very well wired with sort of the power structure on the Hill, as well as some of the younger members. We got to remember Jerry Ford was a young Turk himself when he overthrew the leadership and got himself elected to replace Charlie Halleck.
Kemp was critical of the anti-inflation program, the WIN program, especially there was a tax surcharge fight that he was against Ford on, and you, I guess, because you were White House Chief of Staff. Do you remember any of that? Or?
Well, we tried to stop the speech. And
tell me about that.
We had what had happened was Rumsfeld and I had been invited to come help with the transition, which we did starting on August 9th of '74, for about 10 days or 2 weeks. And then he went back to Brussels and I went back to my private sector job. And then we came back in when Al Haig left about a month. This was mid-September, I'd say, after the pardon. And when we got back, there were a number of things already started in train. One of those was an economic summit with a bunch of people bringing folks in to talk about the economy, what could be done about the economy. One was what became the WIN speech, the Whip Inflation Now speech. And it was, that one was driven primarily by the speech shop by Bob Hartman and his folks. And it was a big, long speech that that had been written for Ford to deliver to a joint session of Congress. we'd only been back a short period of time when Alan Greenspan, who was then the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, came to see me and to express grave concern about this speech. And so I took him in to see Rumsfeld, and we persuaded Rumsfeld that it was a bad idea, and Rumsfeld went in and saw Ford and tried to convince him not to give the speech.
You thought it was a bad idea, why?
It was a terrible speech. And it was going to be this deal. He was going to wear this Whip Inflation Now button. It was red with white letters on it. And it became, he went and delivered it, but he only delivered about half of it because it was so long. And the second half, he took and gave to a convention of the Future Farmers of America in Kansas City, a week or two later. That was the first trip I was in charge of when I went back to work for Ford. And I say it was all built around this concept of whip inflation now. But the speech became known as the lick your plate clean speech, which was not a term of praise. That's how we referred to it on the staff. And I tell the story in my book about the last day Ford was in office, going back into the Oval Office with him. And he took one last look around, then he went back over to the residence to wait for Carter. And I was helping pack up and opened up one of the desk drawers, and it was chock full of Whip Inflation Now buttons that he'd ordered up because he was going to pass them out, but they never got passed out. So we didn't think much of the speech either. And it had been cobbled together on relatively short notice. The White House was still disorganized in those days. You still had some of the old guard, some of the new guard. A lot of the people involved, especially in the speech shop, weren't really wired with the policy types. And, there were some rocky moments in those early months, and that was one of them.
As time went on, Kemp not only was against that part of the policy, but he was also against détente. He thought that that Kissinger and so on were
sort of the Jesse Helms view of the world.
Yeah. So did that register at the Ford White House? I mean, did you regard him as a kind of a burr under the saddle, or did you pay any attention to him?
I can remember the debates over détente. But Jack, I think at that stage would have been one voice among many. It didn't stand out as somebody we really had to focus on. Henry Kissinger was the one who was most directly involved. And Ford basically bought into the Kissinger view of the world in those days. And I always remember the battle of the convention over the platform plank that Helms had basically crafted. And so Helms was sort of the target to the extent we thought of somebody on the other side who was leading the charge against détente, that we tended to think of Helms more than Jack. I think Jack was still pretty junior and relatively new.
Okay, now you would go to this famous 1974 dinner, you and Arthur Laffer and Don Rumsfeld at the Two Continents restaurant. Tell me what you remember about that whole, how did it happen, what happened there, and what impression did it make on you?
Well, the Two Continents was the bar over in the old Hotel Washington right across the street from the Treasury building. And as I recall, Laffer was there, and I think Jude Winniski, and then Don and myself. And
how did it come about? How did
they were
get arranged?
Well, I knew Laffer and I had been in the same class at Yale. He graduated, I didn't.
You knew him?
But I knew of him, and he knew of me. And Winniski was a guy I'd gotten to know as well, too. He was working for the Wall Street Journal in those days. And I still see Art from time to time. Winniski and I eventually came to a parting of the ways. Jude got to be difficult to put it mildly. I think he eventually wrote a book, The Way the World Works, which I always thought was a bit presumptuous for somebody to use as a title for their book. But in those days, we were new. We had economic problems, clearly. I mean, that in part, there'd been an economic summit, but part of that was a reflection of the fact that we were faced with economic difficulties, and we were worried about the economy and where it was headed, and things like inflation and unemployment, recession, and so forth. And some of them, I can't remember, I don't remember whether it was Laffer or Winniski, anyway, contacted us and wanted to go have a beer because they wanted to talk to us about what became the Laffer curve. All of this was an economic theory of the guy from Canada, Mundell. Mm-hmm. And what happened at the restaurant was Art took out a Sharpie, a black marker, magic marker type implement, and had a white linen napkin off the table where we were sitting, and drew what the first time I ever saw the so-called Laffer curve. And I think he claimed that was the first time he'd drawn the Laffer curve as well too. And it basically conveyed the notion that you could raise taxes to the point where you'd get less revenue, not more. And that was the first time I'd sat and listened to Art to talk about tax policy. Excuse me. And I think they were trying to establish a relationship with the new team in town, and we had a good conversation. I wished I'd saved the napkin. I didn't. I don't know what happened to the napkin. Probably, went through the washing machine at the Hotel Washington. But it was it was an important meeting, and we had, when it came time to deal with economic issues, we had just been through wage price controls in the Nixon last half of the Nixon term. Don had been the chairman of the Cost of Living Council. I'd been in the head of operations. I had 3,000 IRS agents that I supervised as they tried to enforce wage price controls. We both thought wage price controls was a terrible idea, something thought up and implemented by Nixon with a lot of urging from John Connally, as I recall, and I think Arthur Burns was for it too. But so we were in search of an economic policy. We ended up, I can remember flying to Vail at Christmas time, that first.
74.
This is 74. And we had a meeting out there with the economic types. Bill Simon was there, was then Treasury Secretary.
Greenspan.
Greenspan would have been there probably. Jim Lynn, who was running OMB, I'm guessing. And I remember the trip because we were supposed to take a plane load of guys and fly them out, meet with the president, and then come back. And I had swung by and picked up Ken Cole that morning. Ken was still there, carryover from the Nixon days. And as we pulled into Andrews Air Force Base in the White House limousine, there was the airplane taking off. Left us. And I was not a happy camper. I found out later that Bill Simon, when he'd gotten on board, he walked up the steps, got on the airplane, and started screaming and yelling about, when I'm on this airplane, I'm the senior man present, and you pick up that door, close it, and move this airplane. Now get the hell out of here. And force the crew to take off and leave us behind. We had to order up another airplane to get out to Vail for the meeting. But that's where we put together a package that I think eventually became part of the State of the Union speech that year.
So after Laffer explains his theories to you, how close to being a supply sider were you at that stage?
Well, it moved me. I thought it made sense. I didn't have a great economic background. I had some undergraduate work in economics in college. One of the things I remember from that period was Bob Novak. It's just a sideline, but Bob came out and covered my first campaign for re-election in Wyoming. I'm running, it's 1980, I'm running for Congress. And he rode with me from Casper up to Gillette, Wyoming in the car and was grilling me on the gold standard and how important the gold standard was. This is another thing that Jack was always big on. And he kept pushing me on the gold standard. And I hadn't heard anybody. He wanted to know what my constituents were saying. And I said, Bob, I got to tell you, nobody in Wyoming has ever mentioned the gold standard to me in the time I've been their congressman. And he said, yeah, right, okay. So we get into the Holiday Inn in Gillette, Wyoming for a big Republican fundraiser that night. And the first guy that comes up to me grabs my hand, Novak's standing right next to me, asked me about the gold standard. It just blew my mind. It was like it had been a plot. It had been all planned. But Novak was a big advocate, a big supporter of the Kemp view of the world. And he had some influence as well, too. But I think clearly had a big impact on me. And the notion of supply side ultimately became something that I basically support. Ford
in the State of the Union address in 1975 did propose some tax cuts.
Yes, but also some budget cuts, as I recall, like offset.
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and look at it.
So did you influence that, or was this a supply side? Did supply side economics inform that decision, or was that somewhere else?
I'm trying to remember. There was one State of the Union speech that was a disaster. I can't remember, 75 or 76. We ended up, in effect, with competing drafts. And Bob Hartman was doing one draft. And we had another draft that had more input. Hartman didn't work well with the policy types. And when he had a draft speech for the president, he wouldn't let anybody look at it until the president had seen it. And once the president had seen it, he wouldn't let anybody change it, which was a hard thing to do if you were working with the policy types. And we ended up in one, this might have been 76 instead of 75, where we literally had two drafts. I had Gergen working for me on the side, producing one draft, and then we'd take it back down. I'd take it into the president, and he would make changes in the Hartman draft and give it back to Hartman as though it were his own work. But he ended up in this terrible position, which we swore we'd never do again, where you're giving the president competing drafts, and he ends up having to be the guy who has to referee that whole fight. And it was a terrible waste of his time and a bad way to do business.
So on your thinking about supply-side economics, you had contact with Laffer, and supposedly Winniski kept firing letters at you all the time.
He did. I used to get a lot of stuff from Jude.
And so did you talk to Kemp about supply side during those days?
Well, certainly I would have heard from Jack when I got to the house in '78.
While
recall.
You were in the Ford White House?
Yeah, I don't recall. He would have been known as a supply sider, and if anything, one of the guys that was helping lead the charge. More forward leaning on it than I was, but I don't have any specific recollection.
Because Kemp Roth was 1976,
Right.
and then you ran for the House in 1978.
78,
And
yeah.
if you remember, Bill Brock organized the whole Republican Party, especially all the candidates who were running for Congress in 1978 were running on a platform of Kemp Roth.
Kemp Roth, yeah.
So do you remember whether that played into your campaign at all?
I don't.
There's a guy named Brian Dimitrovic who's sort of written the book on supply side history, and he says that you told Winooski, quote, "I'm spreading the word about Kemp Roth, but you guys better know what you're talking about." So indicating that you obviously heard about it and that you were campaigning on it, but you were still skeptical about it. Do you have any recollection of all that?
No. I don't question what that's probably an accurate quote. Winooski, Jude could be a pain in the fanny. And he was one of these guys, he just hammer and hammer and hammer. And never had much of a sense of humor about it. Laffer could laugh at it a bit. And as I say, I still see art from time to time when he comes through. But I'm trying to think, the Steiger Hansen, was that on Cap Gaines?
Yes.
That had a bigger impact in the sense of something that got done. I'd worked for Bill Steiger and had all the respect in the world for Cliff Hansen. And both of them were on the committee. Steiger in the House and Cliff Hansen on the Senate Finance Committee. And of course, Cliff was our home state senator. And that was adopted during the Carter administration, I think in that session of Congress before I ran for the House. I think it would have been that same time frame as they were pushing Kemp Roth.
But you have no recollection particularly of Kemp Roth and that whole development?
Well, it was around. It was an issue that we talked about and that we liked and so forth, and that we gave us something to be for.
Right. So it becomes let me just go one other aspect of supply side. On the gold standard, why is it that even though it was sort of the part of the basis of supply side economics, it never got anywhere it never got anywhere with Reagan, it never got anywhere with either of the Bushes. What was wrong with the gold standard as an idea that Republicans would push?
I don't think a lot of people understood it. I think the practical aspects of trying to return to the gold standard would have been extraordinarily difficult. I think in part, too, it was wrapped up in the minds of a lot of people with the wage price controls, just because Nixon announced it all as a package when he took us off the gold standard and used the authority Congress had given him to establish a wage price freeze. And I think it was hard for members to sort of separate that out and think about it. It didn't have a champion. And I think a lot of us, as much as I was involved in the wage price controls, we were trying to operate that, I became a very strong opponent of the whole concept, as did just about everybody involved in that program. I always remember the first meeting Schultz called when he was confirmed as Treasury Secretary after Connolly left. Was to get us together over at his office at Treasury and say, okay, gentlemen, how are we going to get out of these damn controls? He hated them.
Yeah.
And I had great respect for him. He was right.
Right.
But I think it was, to some extent, it was wrapped up as part of that whole Nixon initiative.
By the time Reagan gets to office, and then you're cutting taxes along the lines of Kemp Roth, did you regard yourself at that point as a supply sider you're 2 years into Congress? Yeah,
I thought, by the time 1980, 81 rolls around, we're all Reaganites. I'd been for Jerry Ford 4 years before, but we're all Reaganites. And most of us are supply siders, or, are comfortable with that designation or with that label.
Well,
It's a little bit like being called a neocon in the Bush administration.
you say in the book that you were quoted in 2003 as saying deficits don't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Were you quoted correctly?
Well, you've got to put it in context. We had a conversation, as I recall. I think it was before 2003, because Paul O'Neill was part of the conversation, and he left after 2 years. But it was O'Neill and myself and Alan Greenspan. And I was trying to make the point that what Reagan had done in his first term was to expand defense spending, increase defense spending significantly, and cut taxes at the same time, which led, at least in the short term, to bigger deficit. And that in that context, that deficit didn't matter. Mm-hmm. Ron Suskind got O'Neill's notes. I think Paul just gave him all the notes he had, and out of that came the quote Cheney saying deficits don't matter.
Mm-hmm. So I mean that is a classically supply side side notion. Mm-hmm. So does that indicate that you really were a supply sider? Did you ever call yourself a supply sider?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. 81. Everybody's for the 81 tax bill, but then mm-hmm. Kemp, you're part of leadership, right? 81.
I'm the newly elected policy chairman.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So then 82 comes along, and Reagan's going
Tefra
is going to pull back on some of the 81 tax cuts. You're part of leadership. You and Lott support the president. Mm-hmm. Kemp does not. Mm-hmm. He criticizes this as a tax increase. What did you guys think?
Well, that was Jack being Jack. It was. I'm trying to recall the sequence now. We did Tefra. We had to go back and, in effect, tweak what we'd done previously. And we did it at the request of the president, support of the administration. Bob Michael probably was there as well, too. And Jack would have been the foremost leader in opposition.
But a member of leadership.
But still a member of leadership, yeah.
So this is off the reservation.
Yes and no. I mean, the administration got done what it needed to have done. A few years later, Trent and I were off the reservation in the, what was it, 86 tax package. And partly because we hated the bill that the Democrats produced out of Ways and Means, and didn't like the idea. The White House is saying vote for it, and we'll clean it up when it gets over to the Republican Senate. And we didn't like that. And I'd met with Baker by then as Treasury Secretary, and Jim and I had some pretty intense dust-ups over the tax package, tax reform. But what Trent and I ended up doing was killing the rule. We snuck up on the White House and didn't tell them what we were doing, but we got the votes rounded up and killed the rule when they couldn't bring the bill up. And that's when, as I recall, that's about the time that Reagan came to the Hill and spoke to the House Republicans in the caucus, big meeting room over there in Rayburn. And he'd been to the funeral down at Fort Campbell that morning for the guys in the 101st who'd been killed in a plane crash coming back from the Sinai. And walked into the room and he talked about sacrifice and patriotism and so forth, just a very moving and emotional, off-the-cuff kind of thing that Reagan could do very effectively.
Silent prayer at the beginning of the meeting.
And then said, now, gentlemen, about that tax bill. And that's all they had to say. I don't think he knew what was in the bill. But guys were jumping up, Henry Hyde, saying, I'm with you, Mr. President, you can count on me. Turned around, I don't know, 60, 70 votes. Took it back to the floor and passed the rule and sent the bill and then passed the bill and sent the whole thing.
Do you remember what Kemp's role in all that was?
I don't. What I remember is the collaboration with Trent. Jack, I'm just thinking at that stage, I guess he's still conference chair.
Yeah.
Someplace in there where he stepped down.
Well, he
Must
would
have
have
been
presided
80.
over that session.
Yeah.
Reagan.
But must have been 87 when he stepped down from the leadership to run for president.
Right. Yeah. You continued to oppose the rule, didn't you? The second time around. I mean, you were one of the people who stuck to your guns.
Yeah, I didn't jump up and say I'm with you, Mr.
Even
President.
though Reagan had appealed to you.
As I recall, I'd have to go check, but
I think that's I've read the history on this, and what's interesting is that in 82, Kemp is off the reservation vis-a-vis the White House. In 86,
Kemp's on the reservation.
You're off the reservation, and Kemp is on the reservation because he changed his mind about in order to keep Kemp, tax reform moving along.
But my recollection is, Bob Michael would be the one. He might not even remember it. Maybe Pets would. That there was a moment on the floor when we had a session with the House Republicans. I think it was like a caucus, where I think what I recall saying is, and this was at Bob Michael's behest, that I told a group that I couldn't switch. I was too far committed. But I thought it perfectly appropriate if others wanted to switch and approve the tax package. But again, Michael somebody would have to confirm that. Yeah.
So when he was conference chair and you were policy director, what were your respective jobs? I mean, how did you work together? And what was your job to do, and what was his job to do?
Well, the conference chair presided whenever we had a meeting in the House Republican Conference, which we would do periodically. If there was a big vote coming up, or when you were having leadership elections, those kinds of things, Jack would be the guy. The conference chair would. My job as policy chair, we had a policy committee made up of several members of the House, and there was a formula for it, but it was a broad-based group within the House Republican Conference, and we would meet just about weekly and have a session where lots of times we'd put out statements on various policies, and we'd bring a draft statement to the committee, and then they would vote on whether or not to approve it. Now, our role was different. When I took over was at the same time Reagan got elected. So we went from a position where we had Democrats downtown, and the policy committee was sort of engaged in taking shots at the Carter administration, to a situation, which is how it worked the first 2 years I was there, but I wasn't the chairman. I became the chairman in 80 when Reagan came to town, and there we were pretty much most of the time in the business of, if we issued statements at all, making sure they tracked with the administration, and in fact reinforcing the administration. It mattered less what we did because the administration really was, for the most part, going to set policy, and we'd follow there.
You were in the minority in those days, even though Reagan was in the White House.
Right.
How was it operating as a minority under Tip O'Neill, and then Jim Wright, and then Tom Foley?
Well, I had the misfortune All the years I was in the House, we were always in the minority. I don't think there was anybody in the caucus at that stage that had ever served in the majority in the House of Representatives. Maybe Bob Michael for one term or something like that. But we had a period of time there at the beginning of the Reagan administration where the combination of the House Republicans, because we'd picked up some seats in 80, together with the Boll Weevil Democrats, who are, there aren't any left now, but in those days there were probably 30, 35 Boll Weevil Democrats. People like Phil Gramm as a Democrat. Phil worked with us, supported us, sponsored Graham Redmond, took a lot of flack from his own caucus, so he resigned as a Democrat, went home and ran for re-election as a Republican, and won. And so there was a decided difference between what it was like those first couple of years with Reagan in town and how that evolved over time. Now, Tip O'Neill was a guy I had a lot of respect for. I really liked the Speaker. My wife and I had written a book about Speakers of the House called Kings of the Hill. I'd sent him a copy of it as just a courtesy. And one day he sent a page, he's sitting in the chair, sent a page to get me and called me up to the chair, and he wanted to talk about the book. He'd read the whole thing and liked it very much. One part he challenged was he didn't think we were kind enough to Sam Rayburn. He loved Sam Rayburn. He thought we should have given Rayburn more credit. But there was a different feel. Now, Tom Foley was a good friend. But Tom became Speaker right about the time I left to go to the Defense Department. So I can remember Jim Wright was a problem. I had personal difficulties with Jim. And I can remember going back, this was after I became Secretary of Defense, on the day that Speaker Wright went down into the well of the House and announced his resignation. And I didn't want to miss that. I was there to watch.
What was your problem with Jim Wright?
He had pulled a stunt on the rules. I can't remember even what the issue was, but in effect, what he did was had two legislative days in one that made it possible to accomplish whatever it was he was trying to accomplish with the rules, and it was a very heavy-handed kind of way to run the place. And I was quoted as saying I thought he was a heavy-handed son of a bitch, and that ran in the newspapers. Did not endear me to him, but Bob Michael and he had, at one point had, and I want to be careful here in terms of what I say. I don't want to accuse him of something I can't back up. But there were questions about Central American policy and so forth, where there were major differences. And Speaker Wright he didn't have the stature that Tip O'Neill had, for example. And as I say, Tom Foley I considered a personal friend. I got on well with him, but in a relatively short period of time, my relationship with Speaker Wright had gone sour. That was shortly before I left and went to the Defense Department to become secretary.
So how did Kemp relate to the various Democratic leaders?
Well, I think as far as I know, he got along fine with O'Neill. But I'm trying to remember when Jim left, or Jack left the House.
He left.
Would have been
He left.
88.
He did not run for re-election in '88 because he was
Yes.
running for president.
All right.
So, and he left the leadership in '87.
Right, and so he might have been there just for the very beginning of Foley's time. But Tom had good relationships with a wide group of people, and I would assume Jack had a pretty good relationship with him. I don't know what his relationship was with Wright.
So besides your being on the leadership together, you had similar jobs or related jobs on foreign policy. You were on intelligence. he was first on defense approps, and then he was the ranking member on foreign ops.
Mm-hmm.
And this was during Contra time and all that.
Right, Boland Amendment.
Yeah, so what do you remember about collaborating with him on like Contra issues or MX missiles or SDI?
Yeah. Well, Jack would have been supportive of a strong national defense. We never served on a committee together.
Right.
Because I served, on intelligence, and I was on the Interior Committee. And Bob Michael had put me on intelligence. And I served there for the last 4 years that I was in the House. Jack, I don't remember Jack being that active on defense issues. The guy in that group who spent a lot of time on those kinds of issues was Newt. And but I don't recall in terms of working with Jack. I'm sure he probably made policy speeches at that point and so forth. But I didn't think of him as a leader on those issues. Not that he wasn't actively involved, and he would be, but when we got on the Appropriations Committee or Armed Services, and again, I tend to think of it in terms of what it was like after I became Secretary of Defense, and of course that was, by then Jack was at HUD. He was no longer in the House.
He was a big booster of the Contras, and there was a commission, I think.
The Kissinger.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kissinger.
And Kemp was on it.
Okay.
So then he was partly responsible for funding the Contras.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't.
No, I mean, I was a big, strong supporter of the Contras too.
Right.
And as a number of us were. And that was a source of major controversy vis-a-vis the Democrats.
I am going to interview David Obey, by the way, who was the chairman of Foreign Ops when Jack was the ranking member. And what do you remember about the fights on the Contras? Because Obey must have been in the thick of it. I don't have chapter and verse, but what do you remember about those times, about fights over the Contras?
Well, I'm trying to remember.
I mean, there was Boland amendments.
There's a Boland amendment. It seems to me Speaker O'Neill had a sister who was a Catholic nun. I don't know if you remember any of that.
Yeah.
And she'd gotten involved with the pro-Sandinista side. And then Boland himself is very close to the Speaker, as I recall. Eddie Boland?
Yeah, Eddie Boland.
Yeah. And it was a source of considerable controversy. I got involved in it especially because I was the ranking Republican on the Iran-Contra Committee. And I spent, that came up at the tail end of '86 and then through most of '87. We were doing the investigation of the sale of arms to the Iranians and then the funneling of the money back to the Contras and so on. And when we talk about that period of time, my mind tends to focus in on what we did on that committee on the investigation.
Right.
But it was a knockdown, drag-out fight. I don't have any specific recollection of Jack. I'm sure he was involved, but I don't. I can't give you much on
one just last question about this aspect. Kemp generally supported Reagan on most foreign policy issues, but when he started negotiating with Gorbachev and doing an INF agreement and that sort of thing, Jack again was off the reservation and was criticizing all that, and in fact called for Schultz to be fired as he was going into the '88 campaign. Do you remember any of that?
No, I'm not surprised by it, but I don't remember any call for Schultz's firing.
So,
Excuse me.
In 1988, he's running up to, it's obvious that he's going to run for president.
Mm-hmm.
Did you talk to him about his candidacy? Did you?
My interest, religiously stayed out of all presidential campaigns that cycle. Rumsfeld was running. Kemp was running. George Bush was running. Al Haig was running. Bob Dole was running. I mean, everybody. Howard Baker, I think, was in it as well, too. And what I was angling for was to advance up the leadership ladder. And I didn't want to get my leadership aspirations tangled up with somebody else's presidential contest. And if I went for Rumsfeld, for example, which just based on friendship would have been the direction I probably would have gone on, that could get me crossways with members who were Kemp supporters or Bush supporters. I can remember Barbara Conable having Lynn and I down to dinner at the Watergate with the Bushes one night. And during that period of time, they were trying to recruit me to sign up. I refused everybody. What I was trying to do was to move into the number 2 slot without opposition, because by then it was pretty clear that Trent was going to run for the Senate. And I wanted to be Bob Michael's successor. And the best way for me to do that was to get into the whip's job and get position. And to the extent I could do it without opposition was going to help a lot, because I went up the leadership ladder, only had a contest once, and that was the first time. Other than that, nobody ever ran against me. And I wanted to continue that track record, so I didn't get involved in any of those, like for Jack or anybody else.
Right. I mean, Kemp's presidential campaign didn't
go
get very far.
Yeah.
But
neither did Rumsfeld's.
Yeah, right. So, but the question about Kemp is, I mean, you've seen 5 Republican presidents and, been intimately involved with at least 3 of them. So, do you think that Kemp was presidential material?
I think he could have been. I thought he was a good choice when Dole picked him to be his running mate in '96. And that was sort of the first hurdle you had to get over, was this guy up to the task of taking over. And I thought Jack was. I thought he had a broad range of interest. He was a dynamic, charismatic kind of a figure. And I think he would have been a good president.
Sound judgment? Good temperament?
Well, compared to what? Yeah, I think good temperament. I think it would have been a sobering experience for him. Jack had strong feelings on some issues, and as you mentioned during the course of our interview today, times when he, quote, got off the reservation. I don't know that he would have had the patience for it, because it's very, very hard work, and all that stuff that suddenly is on your platter as president of the United States. But I don't. I would not have objected to or been concerned about Jack Kemp presidency. I think he'd probably been pretty good.
So going into the George Bush presidency, you're defense secretary, he's HUD secretary. I take it that your fields were so far distant that you didn't really have much to work on together, did you?
No, but there was the standing joke on Jack always was he had his own foreign policy. And so it was not, he had a broad enough range of interests that I didn't really hear from him much on defense. I remember he and Jim Baker getting into it over who was running foreign policy.
Talk about that.
Well, the recollection I have in my mind, and you need to check this with somebody else, is going into the Oval Office for a meeting, and I think it was Baker had come in and said something. Jack was already there. Said something to Jack or something to the president, and made some comment on Jack, and then left. And Jack went jumping over the furniture, trying to get at Baker to follow him out down the hallway, because you should call Jim on it. That'd be an interesting story to tell. But
so let me understand the scene. The scene is the Oval Office.
it's the Oval Office, as I recall, and
Yes.
they ended up with
So is the
Kemp.
president there?
I think so.
Okay.
Baker could tell you, but my recollection was, I think that's the way it worked. Was it ended up with Kemp chasing.
So so anyway, so the president's there. The two of them are in the Oval Office. You come walking in.
There may have been some others around too.
Okay. And then what happens? Baker goes out and Kemp chases him?
Baker made some comment to Jack and then took off, and Jack took umbrage at whatever it was Jim said, and I can't even remember what the dispute was about. Something that Jack had done, as I recall, that constituted an infringement on the.
Was this over Israel?
I can't. It's possible. I can't remember what the subject was, but was Jack jumping over the furniture?
Seriously, jumping over the furniture,
Well,
or just shoving it out of
Hasek
the way, or what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and trying to catch up with Baker.
And then what happened?
I don't know. They disappeared down the hallway. You ought to call Jim on it
We will.
and ask him about it, because it was. It might have been Israel. Jack had good, strong ties and worked the Israeli thing. But as I say, the standing joke was Jack had his own foreign policy. Just tolerated a certain amount of that.
So how much did he pipe in cabinet meetings on subjects other than HUD?
Well, he would, Jack was never one to avoid comment. He'd speak up. I think whenever he thought he had something to contribute. The cabinet meetings, we had cabinet.
So I sent the advances here for you to sign, but it's
Hi.
Okay.
so I didn't know it was going to go this long.
All right, we'll be through pretty quick.
Yeah, we will. I promise.
We had cabinet meetings occasionally. Most of the time, for example, in the area of Desert Storm and so forth, we were meeting with the National Security Group, and that would not include HUD. I'm sure we had a lot of meetings, sometimes several times a week, when we were dealing with those kinds of crises. But it would be that subgroup of the cabinet. It wouldn't be the full-up cabinet.
We're going to get in trouble with your wife, so we better move this along. As time goes on, you said about the '96 campaign that you were pleased that Kemp was,
Yeah, I thought it was a good choice.
Yeah. Just looking at that campaign, you obviously run for vice president twice successfully. How did you think Kemp performed as a vice presidential candidate?
Well, I think he performed okay. My recollection is I remember going up to see Elizabeth Dole at one point. She had invited me to stop by. And Rumsfeld was helping out. Rumsfeld and Dole were close. They had offices next to each other when they were both junior House members years before. And they talked to me about taking on some kind of role in the campaign, which I didn't want to do. But my recollection of it was that it was not that well run a campaign, that But I didn't think the problem was Jack so much as it was just the whole operation. I mean, Clinton was going to be a tough opponent anyway, as he proved to be, and that they never really got their act together in terms of having a first-rate national campaign organization.
So, final question. How do you think Jack Kemp ought to be remembered in history?
Oh, I think very favorably. I mean, Jack was, I would describe as one of the leaders of the Republican Party in the latter part of the 20th century. You'd put him on a list, a short list of people who had a big impact on what we did as a party. Probably about as successful as it's possible to be from the House as a party leader. The House doesn't automatically lend itself, just given its sheer size, to the kind of influence and impact that a president can have, or that the national chairman can have. But Jack managed over a long period of time, starting back in the 70s, up through the 80s, to be a prominent player, and very much a supporter of Ronald Reagan's, and sort of the dominant political mood, if you will, at the time. And I think he had a big impact on tax policy, one of his favorite issues.
Mr. Vice President, thank you so much for doing this.
Good. No, happy to do it.